Hi and welcome to your first video on the foundations of yoga. Today's pose is downward facing dog or Adho Mukha Svanasana. This is definitely a pose that can be taken for granted as we tend to flow through it and use it as a transition when we move through the vinyasa practices. And it's not generally a lot of time taken or focus taken as we sit and in this pose. So today we'll discuss some of the common mistakes and ways to resolve them when you're in the pose. That way, when you do move through a vinyasa class, it becomes more natural, and you'll also be targeting the areas that you should be targeting as you move through your yoga class instead of just using it as, oh, that's just something we move through. So, in your down dog, there are several benefits. This is an inversion as your head is below the heart. It increases your circulation and can actually decrease your blood pressure as you're in the pose. And you'll sit in the pose and take the time. Often you'll find that in your downward dog, when you're in a very active class, that's maybe where you'll take a break and find that you're resting in this pose more than you're working. So, but that can be only if you have very good alignment and proper foundations as you're working in your downward facing dog. So let's start in talking about some of the areas where we need to focus, and we'll work on, that's 4 or 5 different areas. So first, let's talk about hands. We're in downward facing dog. The proper positioning of our hands should be at about shoulder width apart or just slightly wider. And then looking at your hands when you're in your downward facing dog. I understand I'm not in downward dog right now. I'm just in tabletop, but the finger position is just the same, where your fingers should not be close together. So we don't want closed fingers. We want them spread apart, but they don't need to be crazy wide apart to the point that it hurts. It's just wide enough so that you have a nice strong foundation. And generally the index fingers are pointing towards the top of the mat and the thumbs are pointing slightly inward, but you'll need to play with this position. It doesn't need to be exactly like that. Just make sure that you play with it so that your wrists don't feel any uncomfortable or any pain when you move through any of your poses, because this is be the generally the foundation that you'll have for your hands in many things like plank and in your downward facing dog. So for the fingers, nice and wide, you're pressing into all your fingers and pressing into that first knuckle in your downward facing dog. Now the next thing, number 2, is we'll focus on the arms. I'm going to push back into my downward dog here. And for now, just for the sake of talking, I am going to keep my knees bent to make it a little bit more easy to visit about this. For the arms, we want a slight bend in the elbows. So if you find that you are hypermobile and you can make super straight arms in your downward facing dog, that's not really where you want to be. You want a slight bend in the elbow, because then you'll feel the activation throughout the upper arms and the shoulders and much more activity as you're moving through this pose. Also, that slight bend in the elbow will allow you to have the turnout in the upper arm in your downward facing dog. And that leads us to number 3 as far as mistakes when we're working in downward facing dog. Generally, you may find that you hear the cue to keep your elbows, or not your elbows, but your shoulders away from the ears. So then you may see people in class doing this, trying to have their shoulders away from the ears, elbows sticking out a little bit. They're sinking down into their downward facing dog. And in this position, you're going to feel probably more weight into the hands and into the the lower arms, into the wrists as you're in this position. Now, having your
shoulders away from the ears, maybe not the best cue. What we really want is to have the shoulder blades spread down and across the back. And to gain that, you'll be pushing into the hands and then turning the upper arms outward. And that outward rotation of the upper arms, that's what helps spread the shoulders down and out alongside your back. And in turn, you should naturally have space between your ears and your shoulders. So your upper arms, of course, will be close to your ears. That's not the space that we want to increase. So that was the third part to think in your downward facing dog. Number 4 is your back. As we move along the back side of the body, in the back, I think most people think about the heels and pushing them towards the earth because that's the way you see it pictured in all those beautiful pictures on magazines. Well, that's not necessarily available for everybody. So we want to think about our back, and the back really should be very nice and straight in your downward facing dog. If you feel rounding as you reach the lower back and you feel the tailbone start to round, then you probably want to work into bending the knees. So, number 4, your tip is to keep your back nice and straight. To do that, bend the knees and keep the tailbone lifted towards the sky. And then number 5, if you can lower the heels towards the earth, go ahead and do so, but don't sacrifice any of the rest of the body as you are in your downward facing dog. Your last tip would be to figure out your spacing in your downward facing dog. And by that, I mean spacing between your hands and your feet so that when you're in the pose, hopefully you don't need to make too many fidgety adjustments back and forth. And the easiest way to know the natural spacing that would be right for you would be to simply come into plank, step the feet back, and feel out your plank here, where the wrists are just right underneath the shoulders, the heels are pushing back, and the feet are spread out just about to be in line with the hips, and then pushing back as you allow the toes to tuck under, or not tuck under, but to release and to push the heels back towards the mat. So any adjustments, if you do need to make them, it should be very minimal, and this should be your natural stance in your downward facing dog position. And then a couple of check-in. Number 1, with the fingers, are they spread wide? Number 2, how are the arms looking? Are the upper arms turned out? 3, are the shoulders spread wide and down the back? 4, is the back nice and straight? And 5, how are the legs? Do we need to bend the knees? Can the heels reach any lower? If they can't, that's completely fine. Go ahead and release. So there, I think I covered about 5 or 6 things there. Probably 6 things overall if we include the distance between your hands and your feet. And that's what we have for downward facing dog. It is one of the most basic poses, but keeping all those things in mind can make you get a little bit more out of it. So you end up working into your shoulders, into the backs of the legs, throughout the whole body. It becomes a very active stretching pose. Now, there's always options when you're in your downward facing dog, and I did discuss having the knees bent, which is probably the most common. Other suggestions that you may hear in class will be to maybe have a blanket to lift the heels and to provide you a little more support if that feels comfortable, or even blocks to have the heels on. You can also have the blocks in front of you and instead have the hands up on the blocks and maybe elevate your downward facing dog just slightly.
I find that to be a little bit more easy. It's a little bit more accessible to reach something that's in front of you and to have the blocks in front of you versus fiddling around with something that's behind you, especially if you're in a vinyasa flow class that moves more quickly. You don't have a whole lot of time to set up props. So the best options are either to grab the blocks in front of you or just simply bend the knees for your modification for your downward facing dog. And your other option could be always just to take a child pose and use that as a recovery option during your class. You'll find many variations of downward facing dog as you move through a class. Here I'll demonstrate a couple. You have downward facing dog. And from there, keeping the foundation, staying strong through the arms, pressing into the hands through the mat, lift the right leg up, and then you have your three-legged dog. And your three-legged dog, your hips are level, but then they may ask for you to bend the knee and perhaps lift that right hip in your downward facing dog. And now we are opening up the hips in your three-legged dog. Coming back into your downward dog, you may take a twist, such as the right hand to the outside of the right ankle, and you have a revolved downward facing dog. Also, you may have balance challenges, perhaps trying to lift the right hand and then the left leg as you stay strong throughout the left shoulder and balance in your downward facing dog. And coming back here. Other challenges you could add in for a downward facing dog would be maybe taking the left leg out directly to the side, really engaging into the hips, engaging into the core, and then bringing it back. Closely related to downward dog, you do have dolphin, and that would be lowering the forearms towards the mat and then bringing the head down and in between the forearms, really pressing into the hands. A good one to keep the knees bent. We'll come back into our downward facing dog. And then from here, you could also come into downward facing dog using a chair. And from here, we'll just step the feet out about 2 feet away from the chair, lower down, and then come into basically a halfway lift, but the head is dropping down in between the upper arms. And the pelvis is tilted into that anterior pelvic tilt. So you're feeling the engagement along the back side of the legs. And I'll softly roll up. So just take a chance and play around in your downward facing dog and maybe about 5 or so minutes before you start a class and see what options are available to you. Even just simply coming into your downward facing dog and then making it a wide-legged down dog, stretching out the back line of the body here, seeing how that feels. So maybe just take 5 or so minutes before you start your next class and really focus on your downward facing dog and use some of these tips to make sure that we're being mindful throughout the class and focusing on our form and alignment so that you get everything you need out of it to feel great when you're on the mat and to feel even better when you walk off of it for the day. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.